And so first, by way of giving you an overview of what we expect and hope to accomplish today in our time with you is to start by defining racial microaggression theory and the taxonomy, but then to talk broadly about microaggressions and how they affect other socially marginalized populations as well, and the manifestations that some of the exploratory research has started to look at. How is this really affecting people's lives in an everyday fashion? Also, we want to talk to you, though it'll be talked about in the context of the studies, we also want to spend some time talking about the implications of microaggressions in everyday life. We want to talk about also the link between microaggressions and bullying, which has really been a hot topic in the media lately, but we know is a long-standing issue, right? And then we also hope, and maybe this is ambitious on our part, but to leave some time at the end where we can open it up for comments or questions, and so we can really engage in a dialogue with you about what you find interesting about this topic, what clarity we can hopefully bring. And so that's our goal of our presentation today. So first off, before I begin though, I want just by show of hands, how many people are familiar with microaggression? Okay, so that's great. So a good number of people in the room. I think what's so telling about that is when I first started this research, and even still today when I talk to people about what my dissertation is about, oftentimes outside of the academic settings, when I say I'm working on racial microaggressions or doing microaggression work, people look at me with really wide eyes and say, oh, so you're at Columbia, that's great. You know, you're doing something that is so far removed from the everyday vernacular of what people engage in. But very quickly when I give them the definition of racial microaggressions, a lot of times people are able to start to conceptualize right along with me why this is such an important area to study. And so I want to start there by really explaining what we mean when we say microaggressions. So microaggressions are those brief, commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities that communicate really hostile messages to marginalized groups. And so this work started out by looking at racial and ethnic minorities, but what we now know and what was very clear early on even is that other groups as well, women, LGBT individuals, the poor, people with disabilities, people from religious minority groups are also negatively affected on a daily basis very often by microaggressions. And perpetrators of microaggressions, and I think this is something really important at the onset as we start to talk about examples, to know is that perpetrators can oftentimes be unaware that they're engaging in microaggressive behavior. And so I think this is really an important note, is that oftentimes when I talk to people about microaggressions, they'll say, well, I know that I could have been guilty of that, or I know others who were guilty of those types of behaviors, but they did not mean. And so the intention is really important there, and that's different than when we think about more traditional forms of racism, right? When we think about the intention to be overtly racist, or we think about the intention to be overtly sexist. And so that's really kind of a contrast when we think about in terms of microaggressions. So first, I want to start further with racial microaggression taxonomy, which is really the foundation of microaggression work. And this concept of racial microaggressions actually is not new to 2007. It's not new to 2011. It was something that was a term that was first coined by Chester Pierce in 1978. And what he and his colleagues did was they analyzed commercials, and they looked at the subtle messages that were communicated in those commercials that really sent denigrating messages about black people at the time as who he was looking at, that really said, oh, you know, black individuals are in subservient roles, they're not part of a family unit, they're not allowed to have any power or authority. And so he took the theories and explained it in the context of how these implicit messages really serve to marginalize that group, but also communicate to the perpetrators that that is abnormal experience to be black, to be African American, be a part of a family, for instance. And so what happened in 2007 really, and you notice there was a big gap, right? So it was a very important kind of finding and conversation to have, but really research didn't spend a lot of time in the literature exploring that further. And in 2007, what Dr. Sue's work did was to really say, let's see if we can take the theory a little bit further and think about it in the context of a taxonomy that we can develop to understand a little bit more about the nuances of what racial microaggressions are. And that's what he did. And so I'm going to show you an illustration of the taxonomy, which, again, it came out of this understanding about racial microaggressions and now has been extrapolated to other groups. And so there are 3 different categories of microaggressions. First is micro-insults. And a micro-insult is a behavior or verbal remark or comment that really conveys rudeness, insensitivity, or demeans a person's racial heritage or social identity. A micro-assault is often, this is a conscious, you'll notice it also clarifies whether these are conscious or unconscious. So micro-assault is the most common link to more traditional forms of discrimination. And so oftentimes this is an explicit derogatory statement that can also be violent, verbal attack, nonverbal attack, meant to hurt the intended victim through name calling, avoidant behavior, or purposeful discriminatory action. Whereas micro-insult and micro-invalidation tend to often be unconscious and unintentional, therefore. And a micro-invalidation is an example would be verbal comments or behaviors that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of persons of color. And so as we go through the different examples of how this affects various social groups, we'll give you more concrete examples of how participants talked about the different categories and how they related in their experiences being a part of a marginalized group. But what you'll see at the very bottom are specific themes that were theorized, and basically all of the studies that we're going to talk about today talk about how they may relate to a certain group of people. And so I'm not going to spend time defining each one, because we will define them in the context of the studies that we're going to present here today. I do, however, want to note environmental microaggressions, and you'll see that the parentheses underneath say macro level. And so oftentimes when we talk about microaggressions, people will say, but these aren't micro in terms of their impact. David's going to talk to you more about impact, and he's going to talk to you more about the defining characteristics of microaggressions. But I want to say to you right at the onset that microaggressions can occur both on a one-to-one interpersonal basis, but they can also occur on an environmental basis. And really when we think about Chester Pierce's pioneering work, what he found is, these messages that are being communicated through commercials, that's really a systemic basis when we think about it. Happens on an environmental level, right? It's not one person saying to you that you're not equal or that you're abnormal. It's really you're getting these messages. Another example of environmental microaggression could be at the institution where you work, noticing that there are no people of color in positions of authority or power, right? So that's not, one colleague making a derogatory statement about your group, but it's manifest in an environmental systemic way in which you notice an absence of your group. And so that's another clarification that we hope to kind of emphasize throughout our presentation.
Well, good morning, everyone. As Nicole said earlier, the theory of microaggression, the idea of microaggression has been in existence for, around 3 decades, However, more recently, Daryl Wing-Soo, who is actually a professor of psychology and education here at Teachers College, and his research team that I'm a part of and Nicole's a part of, and his colleagues such as Dr. Smith, have helped to sort of put forth this theory further. Daryl Wing-Soo talks a lot about these defining characteristics. He calls them dilemmas. And these are really the theoretical underpinnings of microaggression. This is a big part of the puzzle that Daryl Wing-Soo has added. And what they start off with is this clash of reality. When we think about people and how they interact in the world, we often base that off of our worldview, or how we interpret the world around us based on our cultural upbringing, based on the way that our families, our societies sort of taught us to view the world. And it's often based off of our various social identities, such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, ability, religion, etc. And so what happens when a microaggression occurs is that there's often this clash of realities where you're having a person from the dominant culture interact with somebody from the the marginalized culture in a way that denigrates the person. And as Nicole mentioned, it's often unintentional. And it's unintentional because it's so ingrained in us. It's just in the fabric of who we are. And so we often don't see them. So this initial clash of realities happens. And that's often where the conflict begins. And then it goes on to this invisibility of unintentional expressions of bias. These are also culturally conditioned. Microaggressions are culturally conditioned. And because they're such a big part of who we are, because of the way we see the world, et cetera, they're often invisible because they're unintentional. Just think about your own life, and whenever you get into an argument or disagreement with somebody, and they say, oh, I didn't intend that to happen. That wasn't my intention. What that's doing is sort of invalidating your experience because you were harmed in some way or you felt pained in some way. And so if we say it's unintentional, sometimes we don't have to talk about it. Like, oh, okay, it was unintentional. I forgive you, what have you. But the thing with microaggressions is that they occur on such a daily basis, maybe even an hourly basis for some people, depending on the environment, is that when we sort of just excuse them as being unintentional, they become invisible. And that can lead to this idea that that there's minimal harm. Nicole made sure to emphasize that because that's one thing that we hope to dispel, is that because the term, we often get a backlash, just the terminology, microaggression. We're not trying to say that micro means minimal at all. We're just saying that micro means that these are these events that happen frequently. So they're happening very frequently through the course of one's life. And so oftentimes when a microaggression is brought to light, let's say somebody experiences a microaggression and they confront the person about that one incident, they come to some kind of understanding. It could either be that they agree, yes, something happened, or there's still disagreement. One thing that is that can be taken away is that, well, that was just one incident. No harm came from that one incident. Well, that's absolutely a fallacy. This is just one of many incidences that the marginalized person has to experience through the course of their daily life. And so we're not talking about harm coming from this one incident. We're talking about the accumulation. So there's this cumulative effect of microaggressions through that sort of pile up on one another that then can create some really damaging psychological issues, but also physical health issues as well. This is an area of research that we're starting to go into. My dissertation is looking at some of these more mental health and physical health outcomes, but we're also finding that there is some credence behind the idea that microaggressions do cause some major damage, and it's not just the one incident, but it's the accumulation of a lifetime of microaggressions. And then also there's this catch-22 of responding to microaggressions. Catch-22 means that the person who is aggressed against, is put in this bind from the very outset, from the very start of a microaggressive encounter, where they might be asking themselves, did that just really happen? So they're sort of questioning the event. And that statement, did that just really happen, might even be questioning themselves. Like they might be thinking, am I interpreting this in the wrong way? Because they're so culturally conditioned and they're so used to experiencing these things. They might also say, did that person intend to harm me? So again, the intention part comes up, even from the person who's aggressed. So from the very beginning, the person who's aggressed is put into this bind where they're extending a lot of cognitive energy. And now that's important to take home as well, because microaggressions don't occur in a vacuum. They occur within the context of our daily lives. So think about the workplace, for example. So a microaggression occurs during a meeting, for example. So the employee is having to think about what's going on for their job. A microaggression occurs, and now they're also having to think about and spend very valuable cognitive energy to think about and process the microaggression. Now further, this catch-22 then goes on to say that, well, how do I respond? If I'm in this work situation, let's say it was my supervisor who committed this microaggression against me, if I respond or call this out, am I going to be scapegoated as the troublemaker? Am I going to be maybe pigeonholed into my current position? Is it going to affect my ability to get promotion? And then also think about it in an educational setting. If a teacher does this, because some of our research has been done in that domain as well. So is a student really going to feel like that they have enough power, that they have enough within them to then confront a teacher about these issues. So it's very complex, but these are the major underpinnings of microaggressions. And we're going to show you a book later that a lot of what we're talking about it was published last year, and a lot of the research that we're talking about comes from this book that we are all authors in. And it also includes these manifestations. Now this is sort of to me, the exciting part, because this is how microaggressions occur. You know, it's not exciting in that these are fun things to talk about, but this gives us a nice visual depiction, some nice information about how they occur. I'm not going to be able to go into great detail into all of these various manifestations, but I do want to let you know that there has been a lot of qualitative work investigating the experience of various marginalized groups, such as ethnic and racial minorities, people with disabilities, LGBT individuals, religious minorities, women, the poor, etc. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about is coming from that research, and most of this research has started from our own Teachers College, so we have a lot to be proud of in terms of that. So I'm just going to go over a few groups. The first one that I'm going to talk about is Asian Americans. This was actually the first group that Dr. Su and his team investigated here at Teachers College. And they did some qualitative studies, and they found a number of themes that were common amongst these individuals that they interviewed about their experiences with microaggressions. I'm going to touch on a few that were probably a little bit more salient than the others. The first one is this idea of alien and own land. You know, this is the idea that these participants spoke about feeling like they were perpetual foreigners in their own land. And I'm not just talking about people that may have immigrated here at some point in their life, but I'm talking about people who are actually born here as well, who, you know, they are just as an American as anybody else, you know, and they get these messages such as, your English is very good. Now that might sound like a compliment, and this is a quintessential example of a microaggression. Let's say examples came that, you know, an Asian American was giving a presentation and somebody afterwards came and said, you know, your English is very good, you know, where did you learn to speak like that? And so they say, well, I'm from here, I learned to speak here. Like, oh, no, when did you come here then to learn such good English? You must have come when you were a child. And so then further invalidating their experience. So you see how these can sort of get away from you like a train wreck in a way. And then we have ascription of intelligence, and that's also, I like the example with Asian Americans because it's not what we find with other groups, which I'll talk about. This is where it also comes across as a compliment. You know, Asian Americans are very much stereotyped as being really good at what? Math, you know, engineering, computer science, etc. And so often from an early age, they might be pigeonholed into these careers where, and it sort of negates maybe what they really would want to do. Maybe they wanted to be an artist or what have you. But because society is saying this is what your people are good at doing, it often pigeonholes people from an early age. So that's an example of how it can look like something that's positive, but actually be something that's harmful to a person. There's the idea of exoticization. This often happens for Asian females who are very exoticized in our culture sexually. And then also just as an exotic people. And you know, we have this term Oriental that I hope that many of us don't use or all of us don't use anymore to describe people, but it really is an exotic term because it's used to describe food and furniture and products, not to describe people. But we often use that in society to describe people from Asia. And so those are just a few examples. Also with Latino Americans, this is a study that I actually did. We found some similarities with Asian Americans. You know, culturally and in the context of American society, it makes some sense that Asian Americans and Latino Americans might have some similar micro manifestations, such as this alien and own land. I don't think anybody in this room probably is unaware of the backlash against immigration that's been taking place in our country for quite some time, but is really coming through currently with a lot of the laws. You know, I think it's Georgia that just passed a law recently as well, you know, really targeting immigrants. There's the ascription of intelligence, and unlike with Asian Americans, Latino Americans are often ascribed a lower intelligence. They're often streamlined into programs earlier on that might be developmental in nature, and often that comes from characteristics of speech, having an accent, maybe speaking Spanish, we make a lot of assumptions based off of that to then, if somebody doesn't speak with what we call a Americanized standard English accent, then we might think that they have a lower intelligence, and this happens quite often for Latinos. Additionally, with criminality, they're often stereotyped as being criminals, and this can come off in subtle ways. One of my participants was attending a top-tier school on the West Coast. Him and his friends, who were all Latino males, were walking across campus. Campus security saw them. There were other students around. Campus security came to their group, and they're probably a group of 5 to 6 of them, and made them sort of kneel down and show their identification. And then once their identification was shown, there was no rationale given for why they were stopped. They were saying, okay, then you can go, but you might not want to hang out in a large group. And so what that's saying is that, I think that the implicit message there was that, if you're a group of Latino males around, that you're a part of a gang. And also, if this goes back to a description of intelligence, if you're a Latino male, you probably don't belong at a top-tier institution because you're not smart enough to be here. So those are a few from those categories. Additionally, we have done studies with Black Americans, and we've found some similarities there with Latinos, for example, the idea of criminality. We know all too often the ideas of somebody walking down the street and then crossing the street because they see a black man walking down because of comfort issues, or referring to different neighborhoods, for example, in our own city where we are right now, as being dangerous because it has a high number of Black Americans living there. Also, intellectual inferiority is very common, or very similar to how it manifests with Latinos. And this universality of the Black experience is also one that I haven't spoken about yet, but it's the idea that all Black Americans have the same experience. And so they're often called upon to be spokespersons for all Black Americans. You could probably ask most Black Americans about this happening in the classroom, for example, where a professor might call on them and say, oh, I'll use Nicole. Nicole, what will you speak about how Blacks might respond to that? And that puts the person in a bind because, one, they might want to speak about their own experience, but they don't want that to then be interpreted to be the experience for the entire race or ethnic group that they belong to. And then this idea of being a second-class citizen, that's pretty much one of the common themes that is common for probably all of the marginalized groups in society, but it's that you're given second-class treatment. Regardless of how far you climb up on the social ladder, economically, in terms of education, there still are lots of situations that marginalized people find themselves in where they are treated substandard. For example, being seated near the kitchen at a restaurant. This happens to me all the time, especially in empty restaurants. I get very upset, and I might just be blowing out of proportion. But the way that I view it is that because I belong to a devalued group, that's the reason why I'm being sat there. We also have the experience of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. The use of heterosexist language is dominant in our society. You look at this from applications, from the language we use. When you shop for people who are getting married, there's this his, hers lines, but what if you're shopping for his? You have to sort of pull from different places. It just dominates our society, and it's something that is very environmental for lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, in that they're not often, when we talk about the use of heterosexist language, it's not something that is often overtly said, sending the message that being gay is wrong. It's a very implicit, a very covert message that's being sent. There's this idea of sexual pathology and abnormality. When we think of the experience of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, we often we perseverate on the idea of the sexual act, and that being all that somebody who is gay, lesbian, or bisexual is representative. However, when we think about sexual orientation, it's not just sexual attraction, but it's attraction on a romantic level, on an emotional level, on a physical level. It's more nuanced than that, but we tend to concentrate on that sexual pathology as a way of making them different from heterosexuals. And then there's this discomfort of the LGBT experience. This is a subtle form that might happen. Let's say on the street. If two men are walking holding hands, they might notice some people might give them a weird look. Now, that's not saying, maybe the person has something in their eye or something, but if it's happening very frequently, the message that's being sent is that, you shouldn't be holding hands. That's not right. What kind of message are you sending to society? So now Nicole's going to go through and talk about a few other manifestations.
The transition that David just left on is important to note. He talked about this idea of sometimes it being subtle and sometimes it being, and people would argue with that sometimes, it's not so subtle, right? And sometimes it being ambiguous. And he even gave you some examples where he said, oh, well, maybe this is a reason why this happened. There's something in this person's eye, or they, intended to make a comment about something else. So I think what's so important about the groups that I'm going to talk to very quickly, not do justice to, but we'll give you references to look if you're interested in hearing more about any of these studies. But the two groups I'm going to talk about, largely we found micro-assaults experienced by these groups. And so that meant that it's different than those things that are more subtle, that people are actually more comfortable being overtly transphobic, for instance, towards that group, or overtly xenophobic towards Muslims. So I just kind of want to put that out there at the onset, that oftentimes when I start first by talking about the study related to transgender population, is the idea that people don't have this social stigma as much with racism or other forms of bias to say, that's maybe not okay. It is more socially sanctioned to be transphobic, unfortunately. And some examples of specific themes that related to this group was this idea that just in our terminology, is he a boy? Did you have a baby boy or a baby girl? Or, do you date boys or do you date girls? This idea that there's this binary limitation on how gender can be expressed or interpreted is one example. This, again, similar to, but also different from the LGB study, we found that people are their discomfort and disapproval for the transgender experience. This idea that, you can be exoticized as a transgender individual, and that you're not an asset as a person, but you're saw as a sexual being, right? And then this real assumption of sexual pathology. One of the participants talked about the fact of being pulled over by the police and being asked, was she a prostitute? And when the person said, when she said, well, why would you make that assumption? I'm not sure why, you would even assume that. Said, well, all of you trans people are, right? All of you solicit sex. That's just a part of what it is to be trans. And so I see some people's eyebrows raising, and that's a good thing. However, unfortunately, the participants very often were able to speak to this experience of being blatantly microaggressed against in a way that many of us will say, oh, I can't imagine someone making that type of comment about my group or about who I am as an individual, right? And so other examples included this last one that I want to point out, this idea of physical threat or harassment. And for trans people, very often just the act of using the restroom, for instance, going into a restroom, and so you'll see the quote, what is he doing in the women's restroom? Depending on how a trans person presents, physically, people may make assumptions about their gender identity. And if they, if someone identifies as a female, but are perceived by others as male, and they use the restroom that most of us never have to second guess, whether you're going to use the male or female restroom, right? But when you go into the restroom, this threat of violence, because someone having a very negative reaction, that can happen on the street, but it can also happen in something as intimate. Imagine every day, everyone has to use the restroom, right? Every day when you go into public spaces, whether it's in your work environment, your educational environment, at some point in the day, you're likely going to have to use the restroom. And so to be able to put in that situation where you're going to be judged as not, being able to do, fulfill basic human need of using the restroom and potentially attacked for that, or, at least verbally, if not physically, is a very unfortunate, often reality that trans individuals have to face. And that's one small example. And so I think I've been saying, transgender, I want to also reference a definition so that I'm clear, because I'm not sure. One of the part of, I think, the challenges with this population experience is the invisibility of even understanding what we mean when we say trans, or what do we mean? How is that different than sexual orientation? And so the definition really is an individual who identifies differently from the sex assigned at birth, or for people whom the sex assigned at birth is not completely an accurate description of themselves. And so it can also be used as a term to describe a community, transgender community. And so I think that's important to know, that idea that there is really a lack of information about this group, and that there really is a common experience of feeling that is socially sanctioned to be prejudicial and discriminatory towards them. Oh, sorry. So I also want to talk about religious-based microaggressions. And in particular, I want to talk about a study that looked at the experience of Muslims in the United States. But in the context of what's going on around the globe, I think it's important. How many people are familiar with the new law that was just initiated in France? So a lot of people, I see hands going up. And so really it was fining anyone, whether they be a French citizen or a tourist coming in to visit, for wearing any type of hijab or burqa, up to $150 or more, depending on the context. So for instance, if there was some suggestion that someone forced you to wear this type of veil or covering, then it could even be more, into the thousands of euros, which you can imagine. How would you substantiate that claim? And so the idea, though, the premise underneath, right, is this message that anyone who wears this type of veil or covering is being oppressed, any woman that wears this, right? And so this really kind of negates this whole idea, and it talks to the pathology of different religious groups and the assumption that one's own religious identity is normal. This idea that, oh, we can make a decision for Muslim women about the fact that, anyone who wears that is being oppressed. And so that's not to negate the fact that there is oppression within every group, right? Within every religious group, we can probably talk to the ills or the oppressive forces or the misinterpretations of that group. However, it does negate the fact that this is an independent choice that a group has the right to make, and has a decision and a history and a cultural value around wearing this type of garb that is completely negated and regulated by government involvement. And wherever you stand politically about it, I guess that's not really the full point, but it's to kind of think about it in the context of your own freedoms religiously. And so, for instance, in a Christian majority environment, if you were able to wear, you're able to wear a cross. And how, what do you think the implications of that would be? And I don't even think it's on, you can't even quantify it on the same scale, but if you think about what the implications of someone telling you that that's oppressive, or that's something that communicates something derogatory universally, right? And so it's really this idea that we know best, that we can intervene, and that our way of thinking about religious values is the correct or the valued way or the more egalitarian way. Another example that these participants talked about specifically was this denial of racial prejudice, this idea that, hey, I'm open to whoever you are, whatever you want to be, I'm an equal. I see you kind of as a person. I don't see you as a Muslim. I don't see you as a Christian. You are who you are, right? And this idea that prejudice doesn't exist, this idea that there isn't some type of, marginalization that occurs for different groups in this country. And one good example I can give you at an institution where I work, we get Christian holidays off. Those holidays are acknowledged. You get 2 weeks off, maybe even a month, depending on what institution you're lucky enough to be at in that case, right? Whereas for the students that were Muslim that worked at that institution, our actual start, come back, begin your classes, move in, was right around Ramadan. And there was, not only was there no acknowledgement in the fact of them not being able to miss class, there was no acknowledgement overall campus-wide around, or that the institution that I worked at, around really the salience of why that's an important holiday to celebrate. And so, again, when we talk about it in the environmental level, it doesn't just manifests in those interpersonal, daily interactions. It also manifests in the way that our institutions, our government, really look at different religious values. Another example, though, how it might manifest on an interpersonal level, and participants talked about this, especially in relation to 9/11 and the assumption that all Muslims were associated with terrorist acts. And people talked about being stopped at a disproportional rate in the airport. They talked about the fact that they noticed when people sat down next to them on flights, if they were able, if they discerned or assumed that they were Muslim, they would ask to be moved to a different seat or display that they were uncomfortable. And so we talk about, when we talk about the manifestations in the everyday life of Muslim Americans, it's really profound. So now I'm going to switch gears and actually turn it over to Dr. Smith.
One of the things that I have learned so much about from Dr. Sue and students like these on his research team is kind of just how the whole idea of microaggressions really provides a context by which you can understand how everyday life and our assumptions as part of everyday life are communicating things to people about their status as full citizens who belong in every way, or as people who are a little bit maybe to the side, kind of marginal, fine, but you're sort of different and not exactly what I think of when I think of a normal mainstream person, right? And it also helps me understand how my taken for granted kinds of comments and assumptions and expectations and ways of communicating are helping to perpetuate that same kind of framework and are helping to communicate those things in the lives of different groups of people. So I sort of think of it as like all this time I've been looking at the photograph, and now I'm sort of being asked to look at the negative of the photograph. And to think about the fact that although certainly, as Dave and Nicole were pointing out, it's not always like a conscious, intentional thing. Nevertheless, the way I communicate my expectations has impact. It has consequences, and I want to be accountable because that's the only way to ever change it, right? Like all those expectations, which are embedded in the status quo, right? What's required from us in order for that to continue on for another generation? Like, what do we have to do to keep that going? Nothing, right? Ignore it. Nothing. All that's needed is for us to do nothing, and then on it goes. So it kind of introduces the idea that doing nothing isn't actually doing nothing. It's not neutral, right? Doing nothing is taking a stand to keep things going on the way they're going on. And so if you want to be part of things being different and things being more inclusive, then suddenly I think, oh, that means I have to do something. What's my something going to be? Well, that's a big question. But first decide that you're going to do something, right? First get to that place and stand there, then start thinking about what the something is. So the form of oppression that I want to introduce into the discussion is one that isn't so often discussed among the usual isms: racism, sexism, heterosexism, etc. And it's classism. You see here the definition that I use, which I borrow from Heather Bullock. She's a social psychologist. The oppression of the poor through a network of everyday practices, attitudes, assumptions. The reason why this definition is important is that in a country like ours, which from its founding days was sort of premised on the idea that we don't have classes here, in a country like this, we're not very good at thinking about what social class is. Mostly we think about it as money. We think about income brackets and checking off who has more money and who has less money, and that's what we mean by social class. But in fact, class refers to a whole network of, policies, procedures, assumptions, expectations, that result in people at different social locations having a really different basket kind of advantages and disadvantages relative to other people. For example, think about like a city sanitation engineer a small business owner and a first year tenure track junior faculty member at a state university, all who make like in the 50s, around $55,000 a year. Well, if you just think about class as being money, they're all middle class. They all make kind of right what the median income is for the United States, which is around between 55 and 57 right now, $1,000 a year. But even just hearing the titles of those occupations, you know already, right, that the way that they are greeted by the world in terms of the assumptions, the expectations, the comments, the ways of being embraced or not being embraced, ascriptions of intelligence probably are really, really different, right? And that whole basket of stuff that's different, that's coming to your mind right now, is what social class is about. It's all that bunch of stuff that accrues to us based on our distance from or proximity to sources of socioeconomic power that make the old cliche come true: the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And while there have always been haves and have-nots, probably lots of people in this room know that we are living at a time in our nation's history where that the equity gap is widening. Something different is happening now. There have always been haves and have-nots, but the gap has been growing since about the 1990s, so that the tiny percentage of people at the top of the socioeconomic spectrum own lots more and have lots more power in all kinds of different ways relative to the people near the bottom of the spectrum than ever was the case in the past. So let's talk a little bit about what classist microaggressions might look like. So you had the framework presented really clearly already as to sort of what microaggressions are. So how might those things get communicated by us within the typology that Dr. Su and his students have talked about? Some of them are present in our just most taken for granted conversation starters, like what we say to each other at cocktail parties all the time. And what do you do? And if you have a partner, you will also likely be asked what your partner does. Certainly, of course, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being curious about that. I mean, this is the thing about microaggressions, right? You can see what's sort of defensible about saying it, but people from poor and working class backgrounds will tell you that they know that they're being put in a pecking order when they are asked this particular question at different times. Other examples of class-based microaggressions, some of them are the fairly overt name-calling that you can hear sprinkled into conversation and media representations on a regular basis. Some of these you'll notice show the intersections of classism and racism, right? Because you know that some of these ways of these derogatory labels for poor and working class people, you'll recognize that some of them are talking about poor white people and some of them are talking about poor people of color. Trailer trash, rednecks, and hillbillies are mostly white. Welfare queen is during the 1980s that you still can hear from time to time. Research has found, and here you see Heather Bullock mentioned again with her colleagues Weish and Williams, research has found doing sort of systematic analyses of media representations of poor and working class people that we don't really see them in newspapers, in magazines, and on TV in the same way that we see people at other class locations. That often they're kind of there for comic relief. Sometimes they are shown as having like good common sense, although they don't have a lot of book learning. And in fact, complimenting working class people on their wonderful common sense. Oh my goodness, you know, my housekeeper, she's so smart when it comes to down to earth things. They understand that these are among the comments, compliments that in fact almost have a double meaning, because why are you congratulating me on that? You know, it's almost like by contrast to the other kind of real knowledge and education that formally educated people have. The denigration of labor unions, I think, is another way that we slam working class people all the time. Labor unions are the one and only way that working people have an opportunity to come together to advocate for their interests in the workplace. Middle class people like me, I have a bunch of them. Chamber of Commerce, APA, the American Psychological Association, lobbyists, think tanks. There's all kinds of opportunities for people at my class position to come together to advocate for themselves. Labor unions are the only one for poor and working class people. And you don't have to like everything that a union is advocating for. People in unions don't like everything that their union is advocating for. But that's different from the reaction that you get almost when you say the word union sometimes, right? The eyebrows go up, people are like, oh yeah, well where I work, the office staff are all unionized, I mean, that to me speaks volumes about something. I leave you to fill in the blank based on what we're talking about today. And finally, I'll say, what does it mean the way we like to wear money as an ornament? Two white shirts, nearly identical, but one has a little logo on it that announces to the public that you paid way, way more for that one than the person over here that has the same one on it without the logo. Why do you like that logo one? Why is it that you want to wear that one into the world? And why is it that you feel different when you have it on? Ask yourself, be curious about that. The meaning of the logo, the meaning of your watch, the meaning of your shoes. Not that everybody doesn't like to have a nice shirt and a nice watch and a nice shoes that work well and are made of nice material, but you know what I'm saying. Given that we are living during this time in our nation's history, as I said, where something is happening, that the gap is widening, I feel like it's more crucial than ever to ask ourselves how, in an unintentional way, we're part of that status quo, and we're perpetuating it if we do nothing. Remember, that's all it needs from us to keep going. So I think the time is here to be following in the footsteps of this research team and ask ourselves about how this something is being actually perpetuated by me, although I don't mean for it to.
This is impact of microaggressions. You could probably gather that. So what we've spoken about so far are the manifestations, the theoretical considerations and underpinnings of microaggression theory, but it also has real impact. Again, we cannot emphasize enough that microaggression does not equal minimal impact or micro impact. That's one thing that we often get questions about when we give these, so we like to preempt that with any as best as we can, because really a lot of the studies that have been done even before microaggression theory was put out does show that there are real mental and physical health costs to dealing with discrimination. Emotional people, marginalized people have been shown to have higher rates of depression and anxiety spectrum issues. Physically, higher rates of health issues such as cardiovascular issues, higher instances of diabetes, a lot of issues amongst marginalized people. A lot of these studies have been done primarily with people of color, but I think that if we were to look at the poor, for example, or LGBT individuals, that we would find some similar results there. One of the study that came out recently is this cognitive costs issue, something that I've spoken about already. But it was an experiment done where they showed people various forms of discrimination, and some of them were ambiguous forms, such as microaggressions, and then some were more overt. And what they found in a test of cognitive ability after this exposure is that those who were exposed with the ambiguous stimuli, the ambiguous forms of discrimination, which are basically microaggressions, showed that had lower results, lower cognitive scores. I think that's really giving us some evidence that people really spend a lot of time trying to make sense of these microaggressions, and that takes away from their ability to make sense of other issues really pertinent to their life. And it also, we find that microaggressions manifest in various settings. I think that's important to look at too. So what we're trying to put here is that we need to look at microaggressions more nuanced and discrimination more nuanced than how we currently conceptualize it. We need to think about how it affects people in the education systems. We already have a lot of outcome data for education, but how come that outcome data is the way it is? We have a lot of workplace issues. There's a lot done on that, on income disparities for various groups. And probably every single group that we've spoken about, there is some sort of income disparity. How come that exists? How is microaggressions lending a hand and maintaining those disparities in income? And then we also have the public setting. This image came out. Who saw this image or knows about this controversy that was out in the media? Okay. So I'm a blogger, and I'm always on like CNN or Fox or what have you, and I read these streams. But this one came out. This was an ad that was emailed from J. Crew, and this is Jenna, who's actually the president and creative director of J. Crew, with her son there. And what it says, she's talking about like how she spends quality time with her kids. Great, great message. And then she also says, "Lucky for me, I ended up with a boy whose favorite color is pink. Toenail painting is way more fun and neon." And so right here, you can't see his toes, but they're pink. So what this did, you know, we can think what we want. I tend to think it was a great thing to send out, not just a great media campaign, but also just a great message about trying to break some of these gender norms, this binary that has been artificially created by culture and society in terms of how men and little boys should act and how women and little girls should act. And there was some reactions. Fox News, one of their contributors, well-known psychiatrist Keith Abloh, said, "This is a dramatic example of the way that our culture is being encouraged to abandon all trappings of gender identity," as if that's a bad thing, or as if everybody's doing that or aren't already questioning gender issues. Additionally, a spokesperson for the Media Research Center said that this was blatant propaganda celebrating transgender children. When I talk about it to my colleagues, it's like, well, why shouldn't we celebrate transgender children? But then how come we're saying that this is blatant propaganda? What kind of messages are those sending? Thankfully, I followed this blog all week on Fox News. Thankfully, most of their readers were in outrage that these statements were even made and said, "What's the big deal? She's having some quality time with her son." I also followed the same dialogue on CNN, and we tend to know the political slantings of CNN and Fox are quite different. But CNN, you know, they put their own spin, but also the majority of their statements were sort of saying, you know, what's the big deal here? You know, this is a little boy spending time with his mom. He happens to like the color pink, and this is probably going to have no bearing on his gender identity or sexual orientation, because that's the covert message that was being sent out from people that thought that had an issue with this. And so why I'm starting off with this for talking about how microaggressions and bullying are related is that society lays the groundwork for how people are to behave and for the creation of bullies. We tend to think of bullying as this one-on-one interaction. Probably your mental picture, if you just think of bullying, is probably a teenage boy or a child or a little boy who is rough and gruff, bigger than the other kids, mean, and who physically is beating up somebody or calling somebody names. However, that image is very real. And we also might think that boy just happened to come to be that way by himself. Well, no, that boy was that was ingrained by his culture. He was taught to be that way. You know, we teach bullies to be bullies, not just by saying, you know, I want you to grow up and be the strong person and fight people if they try to pick on you or what have you, but through the messages such as this. This has a lot of implications. When people disagree with this in such a very strong and forthright way, especially when they're leaders amongst the field and they are out there in the media as much as they are, that has a big impact. That is teaching little boys, when they hear those messages that this is wrong, that no, you can't be like that. And furthermore, why don't you go beat up that little boy? That's what it's teaching. So those are the more intentional forms, but also bullying is much more nuanced. It can involve a lot of social distancing. So you're not really saying anything, but when I read the research on kids who are bullied or have sessions with my clients who say that they were bullying, they often talked about being lonely. Now, it wasn't the beatings that they suffered or what have you that made them lonely. It was this being ostracized, having social distance put between them and the other group that was more dominant than them. So that's a very big form of microaggression right there. So that's one of the main things that I want to, I know our time is ending, but I want to leave you with is just to sort of think about microaggressions and manifestations of microaggressions like bullying in a more nuanced way. It's greater than these individual interactions that we have. It has a lot to do with the environment and how our culture and society has laid this very, very strong framework for how we are to interact with one another. So that's the take-home message that I want to give, but we also want to hear from you and hear any questions or comments that you might have about our presentation.
It's the idea that an Asian teacher would maybe be saying to other teachers where she works, to other black teachers, we're smarter than you. Through behavior. Okay.
Actually, that's not an area that we have researched, but it's an area that we've had lots of conversations about. This idea that microaggressive encounters can occur between marginalized people and, again, between each other.